We're going to start, it's been a couple weeks since we've had this material. We're going to start on 143 at the bottom. So I don't know where that is exactly in your packet. I think you have the page numbers on this. So 143 at the bottom, verse 11. And I'm just going to start there because it's fairly explanatory. So verse 11, Akol kamin haga medina. So they're talking about leasing. And really, the historically accurate term is sharecropping. So they're sharecropping, but they're agreements for sharecropping. And there's the phrase Akol kamin haga medina. Everything follows local custom. Okay. And earlier in the Mishnah, this is a quote from the Mishnah. Earlier in the Mishnah, they had given some specific examples. So the difficulty here is, why does it conclude the Mishnah with Hakol, everything is according to local custom? Why would you need that at all? I mean, so what is the everything including that we may have overlooked? Because you gave us already some very specific examples of what should follow local custom, and then suddenly you're throwing in this everything follows local custom. So what does everything refer to? And that's the next question. Hakol la tue mai. So what is Hakol? What does everything include there? Turn the page. So now it has to give you some stuff you may not have thought about, or that your average reader wouldn't have thought about, and that's what Hakol. That's what everything includes, indicates. Okay, so page 144 at the top. La tui ha titanu rabbanon. It includes this saying from the rabbis, or this teaching from the rabbis, namely, makom shenagu lahaskir ilanot al gabei karka maskirin, makom she'en nagu lahaskir en maskirin. All right, so a place where it was customary to include the trees, the fruit trees, in leasing the land. So here you have to understand the main purpose of leasing the land is going to be for a ground crop of some kind, corn or wheat, something like that. But there happens to be trees, probably fruit trees on the property, and there's some revenue from those trees. You could sell the olives or the whatever, the oranges, things like that too. So in a place where it's customary to include those, so some places it just depends on the place. Some places it's customary to include those, some places it's not. And that's what the everything is. So that's, if it's not spelled out in the contract, then it goes by the local custom. Makom shenagu lahaskir ilanot al gabei karka maskirin. When it's customary to include those, in addition to the land, you include those. Makom she'en nagu lahaskir ein maskirin. In places where it's not customary, you don't include those. Okay, now there's an objection here. Makom shenagu lahaskir. Places where it's customary to include those, maskirim, you include those. Pshita, that should be obvious. Why would you have to say that? Because you already told me that everything follows local custom, and there's nothing that's so out of ordinary with fruit trees. So yeah, fruit trees follow local custom. That's obvious. What? Give me something I don't know already. That's something that's obvious. If that would follow local custom. So now it has to kind of get a little more specific for a case that maybe you wouldn't have figured out on your own if we didn't give you these details. Okay, so now we're giving you the details. Lo tzricha. No, here's why you need the phrase. Because now when it says lo tzricha, it's always because you might come to the mistaken conclusion X. So we need the teaching to tell you it's Y. So here's the mistaken conclusion you might come to. Lo tzricha de kulei alme yahave de betilta. So kulei alme means the whole world, but it means local custom. So local custom, you give the owner a third. Remember, it's a sharecropping arrangement. So you give the owner, tilta is a third. Shalosh. I mean, if you want to learn Aramaic, the taf and the shin are interchangeable in Aramaic. So I have the tlat, the word tlat becomes the word shalosh. Aramaic is really not very hard to learn if you know some Hebrew, if you know Hebrew. So anyway, and tilta is a third. So there's the ordinary, and again, you're going by local custom. Ordinary local custom with a sharecropper is a sharecropper gives the owner a third of the crops, keeps 2/3. If that's the local custom, the azil ihu viave beriva. Okay, but this particular sharecropper, they have an arrangement. It's a deal. It's in the contract. Remember, contracts always supersede local custom. So in their contract itself, it says, "I will give you a fourth." So it's now again. This is the math quiz I had a couple weeks ago. What's more, a third or a fourth? A third. So if you're giving a fourth, you're actually giving less. So you might have this. If you're the sharecropper, you might say "Magdutema damarle." Hi debatzre lach. So you're the owner. You might think the fact that you're giving me less, because most people give a third, so you're only giving me a quarter. Adata de lo yahivna lach be'ilanot. I assumed that meant that you don't get any of the tree stuff. I get all the trees. I get all the revenue from the trees. Because after all, you're paying me less than market rates for the land. So I have that perfectly legitimate assumption that you don't get trees at all. Okay, but Kamash Malan, what we learned from that is that that's not the case. With trees, you still follow local custom unless it's actually spelled out explicitly in the contract. Di baile la frushele, that if that you have to specify that in the contract, because otherwise we follow local custom. So when it comes to extra things like trees, even if there's a slight change which might lead you to believe that you don't include the trees, you do include the trees if that's local custom. Okay, is that clear? Mm-hmm. Any questions? Okay.
What about the 10% that you're supposed to leave for the poor?
So who leaves that?
Yeah.
So it has to be left, and then it's an arrangement between the owner and the lessee. It has to be 10%. So I think whatever. So if it's a third, the sharecropper leaves 2/3 of whatever the 1/10 is, and the owner leaves 1/3. 1/10 of the 1/10. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, that's halakha. Yeah. So halakha is always going to be local custom. Always being clear. That's a law from the Torah. Okay. Makom shenagusha lo laskir en maskirim pshita. Okay, so now they go the other way. In a place where it's not local custom to include the trees, you don't include it. That's obvious too. So why are you telling me that? And now they're going to give you sort of an idiosyncratic case where you might have again this wrong assumption where that teaching that's spelled out tells you exactly how you should do it. Okay, so I'm going to give you that. Page 145. Lo tzricha. No, you need that because of the following case, where you may have been led to the wrong conclusion. Dekule, and you can see it's structured almost exactly the same. It's parallel. Dekule alme, there might be a place where everybody mikable beriva. Everybody here, now the owner, now it's different. Remember in the other case it was a third. Now this other locality, it's not a third, it's a quarter. So things change according to custom. So we're dealing now hypothetically with a place where the local custom is that the landowner gets a quarter of the crops, right? So mikable beriva. The azal ihu, the kibla betilta, but they make a special arrangement, an idiosyncratic arrangement, where the owner is not receiving a quarter, the owner is receiving a third, which we know from a math quiz just a few seconds ago. The owner now is receiving more than most owners. Okay? Mahu detema amarle. So now it's the sharecropper that could say, okay, I entered into this agreement with the following assumption. It wasn't spelled out in the contract, but this was the assumption. Hi de tafelach, I'm giving you more than I should give. Adata dehivlach bi'lanot, because I assumed I was going to get all those fruit trees. That's why I agreed to it. Can't say that, because when it comes to the fruit trees, it has to be spelled out, because local custom overrides any kind of assumption you might have in your mind. You may have been perfectly legitimate in pointing that out in the contract. Once it's not in the contract, you don't have a leg to stand on, because we're following local custom. Kamash malan, it teaches the baile lefrushele. So what you need to do was specify that. Lefrushele means, by the way, it's from the same. Mifaresh means to interpret, like a parshan is a Torah interpreter. So Lifaresh means to interpret, but it also means to specify. You need to specify that. It comes from the same linguistic connection. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Kishem shecholkim batfuah. A quote from the Mishnah. Just as they divide, so whatever arrangement you made, a third or a quarter for crops, you also make that same arrangement with secondary stuff here. Now I'm not talking about fruit trees, but I'm talking about straw. Straw may be leftover grass when you're cutting the lawn. Uvakash. Kash also means straw, but it's like wild grass, things like that. What would you use that for?
Seed.
Yeah, who knows? I don't know. Yeah, for stuff. People use straw to feed their animals, and
Stuffed mattresses.
Yeah, stuffed mattresses. It obviously doesn't have the same value as a crop.
Right.
But still, you're working to make a living. Every little bit counts, and so don't just ignore that stuff. So the local, actually, what the Talmud says is whatever arrangement you're making with crops includes for that stuff. Okay. Amar Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef says something interesting. Bibavel, in Babylonia. Now he's referring to all of Babylonia. So in our Babylonian communities, Nehigu delo yahiv nativ ne larise. We actually had the custom. So actually, which was, it's not just that we're introducing here a new local custom. We're introducing a local custom here that goes against the Mishnah. which is disturbing. It's something that's going to raise an eyebrow. Because we're not just talking about local customs, because the Mishnah has what it has. But Rav Yossi says in Babylonia, we don't actually do that. You're hinting, you're hearing here a hint of a competition between Babylonia and the land of Israel. Remember, the Mishnah is written in the land of Israel. But a lot of Jews live in Babylonia. So he's saying, anyway, it's not our custom to give teven. Teven is one of these words for straw, but it's leftover grass, to the arisa. The arisa is the sharecropper. We don't do that in Babylonia. So he sort of raises that as an objection. Lemai nafkamina. Okay, so what difference does it make? Why are you telling us? Rav Yosef, why are you telling us that? That if you encounter someplace in Babylonia, a landowner that in fact is giving the sharecropper the straw, ein yafahu, it's just generosity. It's not law. Don't learn from it. Rav Yosef says, I'm telling you, in Babylonia, that's not our practice. In Babylonia, the extra stuff belongs to the landowner, not to the sharecropper. Now, you might encounter in your journeys through Babylonia, some landowners that are letting the sharecropper keep the straw. You keep the straw. Understand that that's not law. It's ayin yafa. Ayin yafa, by the way, literally means a good eye. And a good eye in rabbinic parlance means generosity. It's interesting to kind of ponder that for a second, why that body part, a good eye. But that's what it means. So if you encounter generosity, don't extrapolate law from basic human goodness, which teaches us a bunch of things there. Generosity is not always the law. The law includes certain things, but you can always go beyond the law. But just because you see a group of people going beyond the law doesn't mean that it's actually law. It doesn't mean you have to do it. People give money in our tzedakah box. Is that a rule? If you come here, everybody that comes here has to contribute to the tzedakah box? No, it's generosity. Now it may, yes.
Doesn't this go against the concept of the gleanings or the corners of the plot of the plot when you're harvesting?
That's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. It's related, but it's not quite the same thing. So the leavings of the crop. That's really what you're referring to. So gleaning is that when you're done harvesting, the poor can come and glean because there's stuff that's left over. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is that there's also a law called shichacha, which means stuff that you left behind. Like you get one shot as the harvester to go and collect everything, and after that one-time harvest, you will have dropped stuff like in your big buckets and stuff like that. So that doesn't belong to you. That belongs to the poor. Okay, and there's also the corners of the fields. Right. So the corners of the fields, which interestingly are not defined. And this is where the generosity thing comes in too. You get to define. Is that interesting? You get to define what constitutes a corner. Like a corner can be a big thing, can be a little thing. There is a minimum the Talmud comes up with, but there's no maximum. You can leave as much as you want in the corner of the fields. So this is a little bit different, since this is not referring to this is in some ways a crop. So that's what they're saying. Like the extra grass and stuff like that is a cash crop like anything else. So once you take what you want, and this applies to the sharecropper too, then there's a whole thing of the stuff you left behind after your harvest and the corner of the field, and people have to come in and be able to take that. So here they're treating it though as a cash crop and saying it's a cash crop, and what you work out with the owner, what the sharecropper works out with the owner, is subject to contract and also local custom. Martha?
The straw and so on can enrich the soil.
Yeah.
So some people use that as a cover crop, or use it so that next year when you plant,
Yeah, right.
And the other thing, as
or let me just to say, because or you could use it for another field. If you're a big owner, and you've got lots of other fields, you might say, I'm going to collect that straw and use it for fertilizer for another field. So it does have some value, and the Talmud points it out. You can learn farming from studying Talmud, although I'm not too much. Right, I would recommend other methods. but you pick up a few things.
And the other thing I wanted to say about gleaning is I've always assumed that the gleaning is food for the poor. It wouldn't be just something that they would sell.
You're right.
So let's say you didn't pick every tomato or every strawberry or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Or even every sheaf of wheat.
Yeah.
You dropped some.
Yeah.
Or you missed a few.
Yeah.
it's food that they can have.
Yeah. So I always assume that too. This maybe makes us think that maybe it wasn't. Maybe they would actually go and sell stuff. Like would stand at the side of the road, and one of the things they would sell would be straw. It never occurred to me until now also.
Oh, right.
Right. You would think, that it's hand-to-mouth existence, so you just eat what you find. But you could imagine some enterprising poor people that would come and actually,
try to sell
eat one and sell one.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially if the price is high.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it doesn't say anywhere to the poor you must eat this, right? So it's
So it could be straw.
Yeah. Okay. All right. By the way, because this is sort of ancient farming, the marginal notes are quite interesting, and they have pictures on it. The Steinsaltz and his staff really discovered some interesting stuff here, so that we get it right away in this next phrase. 9 is with lo gamrina mine. So you don't learn law from generosity. Generosity is generosity. Okay. Now number 10. Amar Rav Yosef, Buchra v'tafta v'arkavta. These are all Aramaic terms. They mean the first layer of soil, the additional layer of soil, and a third layer of soil. Okay, and what they're referring to is, this is what interesting you learn in the background and a little bit of reading the Steinsaltz, is that the sharecropper, just like the owner, has to distinguish his field from other fields and tell people and indicate borders, boundaries. And so the question is, how far does the owner have to go to indicate boundaries of the field on behalf of the sharecropper? I mean, if you're a sharecropper, you might say, look, I expect a barbed wire fence because these people, my neighbors, are just going to come in, or there's wolves or snakes, or they're coming, and that could easily be an area of dispute between the owner and the sharecropper. What do you provide? And again, it's since these contracts are very general, local custom is going to be very important. So now the Talmud is actually spelling out the owner has the responsibility for 3 layers of soil, which would be a kind of hump of soil that would serve as a boundary, that would distinguish between that field and another field, just so people know. Now that's not going to stop a lot of bandits from coming, but it does indicate that this field belongs to you and it's a border, it's a boundary. Okay. And a little bit more vikane, the chizra de balabai, and also the reeds or the sticks of a fence. That's what the owner has to provide. So the owner has to provide layers of soil that distinguish make a kind of border, and also sticks. So and then the chizra gufe darisa, but actually a fence itself. If you want a fence, like a real fence with thorns and stuff like that, then the sharecropper has to do it himself. So it's an interesting, shared arrangement. So the owner actually does have to provide something, some lumps of soil that indicate a boundary, also sticks. But if you want to build an actual fence, okay, go ahead and do it. But it's up to the sharecropper to do that. Okay, that's the arisa.
That might be the basis for negotiating less or more.
Right. Klala de milta. So now they give us kind of a general way of thinking about it. Kol ikar balma de balabait. Okay, so just what's essential. What's essential to distinguishing this field from another field. That's the balabait, right? That's the owner. Nitiruta yeterta. Anything extra. He wants barbed wire. You want a guard tower. You want dogs. You want something because you're a little paranoid about it, or you just feel like you just need a little bit more. It's like it's so easy to translate this into our terms. Like you're renting an apartment. It's reasonable to expect a lock. Is it reasonable to expect a whole series of locks? And no, it's not necessarily reasonable, and you can provide those. But that becomes your responsibility. Whereas the owner, and this, I'm sure there are laws for renters about what kind of security the owner has to provide. What's the basics in an apartment, and then what the renter has to provide. Nitirati yeterta de arisa. Okay. More from Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef was the Babylonian authority in talking about what we do here in Babylonia. Okay, and some nice pictures that are on the other side. Ve'amar Rav Yosef, Mara. Uzvila, Vidavla, Vizarnuka, the Balabait. So this is interesting. So in the sharecropping arrangement, the owner actually has to provide tools. There's certain tools, a minimum tools. He has to provide a hoe, has to provide a shovel, has to provide a bucket, has to provide a leather bag. It's interesting. These are serious tools that you're going to need that don't just include for farming, but also you'll see for irrigation. So some basics that the sharecropper is going to need. That's interesting to me too, because it assumes the sharecropper is going to come with nothing. Right, sharecropper is poor, dirt poor, that doesn't even own a hoe. So the owner's going to have to provide these things for them. And remember, the owner gets a benefit from it, a significant benefit. The owner, gets, it's not just rent. The owner gets a percentage. Okay. Arisa avid be'yore. But this is interesting. So the sharecropper has to make the irrigation channels because that's labor. So the owner doesn't actually have to provide the irrigation channels for the farm itself. You can expect the sharecropper to do that, but these tools, including the leather bag which holds the water, which I don't know how that works, but somehow it's related to irrigation. So the owner provides the tools, and the sharecropper has to have some labor that prepares the field. Okay.
It's interesting on that point with the sharecropper having the responsibility for digging the irrigation channels, is that you're giving him the responsibility, but I don't think he has liability if he doesn't do it correctly and then ruins the field because of erosion or something like that. So
yeah, well, that's the risk you take as a landowner.
Right. Yeah.
Just like you take a risk when you rent something because people are going to mess up the apartment. So there's a certain amount of risk.
Okay.
So you have to do your job in making sure it's somebody you trust. Yeah. Okay. Okay, if you remember at the end of the Mishnah, they switched to vineyards, and vineyards are different than farms. They're
right.
Kind of different. It's just a different kind of farming, right? So it's going to have it's just the same thing. But whatever you worked out for the grapes, the wine, because the vineyards, the cash crop is not table grapes, but it's wine. So that's you also divide up. So the zamarot are the leavings of that, and that would be used for fertilizer, or like the peels, whatever's left over. And uva kanim, and there's going to be reeds that are left over. So what are the reeds for? We're going to talk about that. But in general, they're for vines. Like you need to set up some stuff and maybe plant them. Some people will plant them to support the vines. I mean, I think vineyards we see today have these wood structures, but you could also plant things. And if you're planting these, they grow up. And then when you're done harvesting, it's some of that plant stuff, that plant material that you use to wine the. I'm talking like I know what I'm talking about, but right, yeah. So some of that stuff actually won't be useful anymore, right? Because you won't be able to wind vines, right? But maybe there's some value to that too, like any other, you have fertilizer or for straw, whatever. Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's what that is. Kanim maya vidataya. So what would anybody need the old used canes for? Okay. Amre devei Rabbi said, Kanim amchulakim shebehem amidim et kfanim. So you can actually fix those and you can use those to support the vines. Okay? Ushnehem misakim et kanim. Okay, and now this is also from the Mishnah. Both split in providing the structures for the vines, assuming they're not there. So when it says together, it doesn't say what the formula would be. But together they provide. And presumably it's half and half, right? I'm sharecropping in your vineyard. You and I then go in together in purchasing or providing the sticks that we're going to need to wrap the vines around. Okay? Lamali, why do we need that? That seems obvious. Okay? Keep going, page 147. Matam kamar. And the reason is because it's teaching matam shneim chokim bakanim. The reason that they're dividing in the structures, the reeds, mishum shnehem misakim et kanim. The reason that they divide them, that you divide once, let's say the reeds fall apart or the wood falls apart, you divide them evenly. The reason for that is because you both provided them. So it gives us the reason for why you divide them. You divide them because it's a joint responsibility to provide them in the first place, so they're jointly owned.
Those canes can be cut each year in the winter to start new vines and new plants as well. So it allows to either replace the ones that have rotted or to expand the vineyard.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right. We're going to read this Mishnah, which I think actually brings us to a lot of really interesting material, which you could easily expand to our times. And it's basically what happens if conditions change, right? So you have this whole leasing agreement, sharecropper agreement, and you're expecting a certain amount of rain, right? And so what happens if what happens if normal conditions no longer apply? What do you do for a contract that's written for a particular era, and suddenly that era is gone? Yeah. Well, you could also think about mortgages that were sort of dependent on certain real estate prices, and suddenly the economy collapses, but you still got those mortgages. So it's something we had to deal with the country in spades, in 08 and 09, and we're still dealing with it right now. So what happens when conditions drastically change? how far do you go in changing the contract, and how much of it is just a local issue between you and your bank or you and your sharecropper, and when does it become a government issue where the government intervenes? So that's an issue in the Talmud too. For the Talmud, it's much more dependent on weather patterns than the economy. Although they were definitely there was economic patterns in those days too, but they certainly had the issue of, well, is this just a local issue? You keep the contract and that's what you do, or what happens when it becomes a national issue? All throughout our locality, we're facing these sharecroppers that can't pay off what they agreed to pay off. What do we do? So, all right. So this Mishnah starts with that, and then we'll continue with it for several weeks. So I'll just finish the Mishnah. Hamekabel sadeh mechavero. Okay, so you receive a field. This is in a sharecropper arrangement from an owner. Vehi beit hashlachim o beit hailan, and it's either an orchard, because obviously orchards need lots of water, or it's an irrigated field. It's a field that depends on irrigation. If a field that depends on irrigation depends on a water source somewhere nearby. Okay, Yavash hamayan. The local spring dried up, which you certainly did not expect. Climate change.
Right, some seasonal, some climate change that was unexpected. Everybody expected that body of water to be there all the time. And I rented your field on that basis, but it dries up. V'niktzatz hailan, and therefore the field, the trees all dry up. Eino minakeh lo min chakoro. You're not allowed to reduce from you still have to pay the owner what you agreed to pay. You can't deduct just because this is their first go round. You can see the Talmud will have a hard time with it, but the general principle is that just because that field dried up, that local field dried up, doesn't mean that you unilaterally can change the contract now. You still owe the money. You still owe whatever you owed. Okay?
So they didn't have in ancient times acts of God that they can call back.
Yeah, they did. So, yeah, remember that crop insurance would be something you would pay for, so it would be part of the contract. But this is just the first go round. This often happens. In general, they're saying the contract's the contract, and if local conditions change, that's too bad. You should have put it in the contract. That's the first go round, but it's not. It's never the end. Because look at this. Right away, it changes it. Ima marlo. If you specified, chachorli lis mi sadeh beit hashlachim. Lease me this field, which is explicitly an irrigation field. I'm putting this an irrigation field in the contract. Sadeh beit ilanza, or lease me this orchard. If you specify, and by the way, you don't have to specify that if the water source dries up, I don't have to pay you. All you have to say in the contract is, I am renting from you an irrigated field. As long as you specify that, suddenly yavesh hamayan v'niktzatz hailan. If the water source dried up and the fruit trees dried up, at that point, you can deduct. You can deduct. You don't have to pay him as much. Okay, just specifying what you're doing means that you can.
You have to specify everything.
Although here you don't have to specify. What's interesting, you don't have to specify everything. You're just specifying that this is. We understand that this is a irrigated field. Once you say that, then you're opening the possibility that the irrigation climate could change. And once the irrigation climate changes, you're opening the possibility of renegotiating the contract, which you can see the Talmud is troubled with that too, because it can lead to lots. Okay, every time you're going to renegotiate the contract, so they have what do we call it? Moral hazard? I mean, there's issues that come up with us too. When you open the door to renegotiating contracts, there can be problems. Okay, we're going to stop there, but I'll take the question.